There's a whole lot of brilliant people who are as prejudiced as they can be. A whole lot of people graduate all kind of schools and read all kind of books, still prejudiced. It is based partly on ignorance, but only partly. All right. As we move to the end of this century, in the Caribbean islands, the Caribbean radicals that were never tolerated in the Caribbean islands then are now, because the Caribbean mind flourishes best away from home, still do. The Caribbean radicals were restless. In Jamaica, Albert Thorne, J. Albert Thorne, Robert Love, these were the people who laid the basis for the emergence of Garvey. It's about to be run out. Marischal was propagating in Grenada. He would later be one of the early advocates of independence in the Caribbean islands. Then a young man in Barbados, H. Sylvester Williams, had found the Pan-African League. Near the end of the century, he would call the first Pan-African Congress.
The rise of Pan-Africanism in the early 1900s marked a significant movement towards the unification and empowerment of people of African descent worldwide. This intellectual and political movement sought to address the systematic injustices and racial discrimination faced by Africans and the African diaspora, advocating for solidarity, self-reliance, and the reclamation of African identity and heritage. A key figure in developing and promoting Pan-Africanism was W.E.B. Dubois, an influential African-American sociologist, historian, and civil rights activist. Dubois's contributions to Pan-Africanism were profound, both in his writings and through his organizational efforts. His seminal work, The Souls of Black Folk, published in 1903, articulated the double consciousness experienced by African Americans and highlighted the need for social and political equality. Du Bois was also instrumental in organizing the Pan-African Congresses, starting with the first in 1900 and subsequent meetings in 1919, 1921, 1923, and 1927, which brought together delegates from Africa, the Caribbean, and the United States to discuss and strategize on issues affecting people of African descent. Du Bois's vision of Pan-Africanism was one of global solidarity and intellectual collaboration, emphasizing the importance of education, political activism, and economic independence. He saw Pan-Africanism as a means to challenge the colonial rule and racial oppression, advocating for Africa's political unification and its people's empowerment.
So the ideas of Pan-Africanism, the formal ideas, would be coming from the Caribbean. The three best-known Pan-Africanists all came from Trinidad. H. Sylvester Williams, who started it, George Padmore, who was the active theoretician of Pan-Africanism and one of its finest writers, C.L. Aura James, still alive, living in London. Now, why is it that these three Trinidadians, fathers of Pan-Africanism, never could unite Trinidad? Because their theories at home wasn't that respected or accepted. Something which I have said before and have been saying through the years is that the Caribbean islands always produce men of vision whose vision of life is larger than the island that produced them. And in order to flourish, they've got to leave home. Because there's no space for those kind of large ideas. The British programmed you into a limited mentality based on dependency on them. America let your mentality flourish, then they frustrate it based on your dependency on them. Too many times we argue over the relative merit of oppressors instead of arguing against both oppressors. We start arguing, my oppressor was better than your oppressor. Now, Booker T. Washington is literally the kingpin of the lot in black America now. 1900, H. Sylvester Williams calls his Pan-African Congress in London. W.E.B. Dubois attends. Now the global importance of African problem is moving. And the Booker T. Washington program has spread to Africa. No matter what you might think of the Booker T. Washington program in the United States, his concept of training for self-reliance, for self-maintenance, was what the Africans wanted and needed and still do. He had the more practical program in education. And because he told us to go light on politics until we finish our houses and our streets and learn how to make our own clothes, we assumed that he was telling us to abstain from politics. What he was saying that once you own a house and once you own the brickyard that furnishes the brick for the house, and once you're making your own shoes, once you master the real estate in your own community, nobody's going to have to tell you that you got to be political in order to protect it. This thought is going to come automatically. So all he was thinking about is that Dubois was premature. That Dubois' idea was coming a little ahead of the readiness of the people to absorb the idea and work with them. That coming out of slavery, less than 50 years, we needed basic things. Well, some of these basic things we don't have today. We still need basic things. We can create an industry making our shoes. We should start with a pocket handkerchief. I said, if you want to make a locomotive, start with a safety pin. If you can't make a safety pin, give it up. But what Booker T. Washington was training for at Tuskegee, the point we missed then and now, was nation management. This is what he was really about beneath all of this. And yet, he was the only person that could go to the corporate America and get large sums of money. Andrew Carnegie thought so much of Booker T. Washington, he would put $500,000 in the bank and tell Booker T. Washington to go each year and draw the interest. That he can have he'll leave the $500,000 there. You go each year and draw the interest. It started at $22,000. $22,000 in around 1900. That's about equivalent of $100,000 today in buying power, maybe more. And all he had to do is to go there and present a note and pick it up. So quite a few people giving money to Tuskegee gave money to Booker T. Washington directly. So Booker T. Washington did have a private fortune on the side that he could manipulate. He began to buy up black business, especially newspapers. He established a spy system where if a preacher preached a sermon, an anti-Booker T. Washington sermon, the summary of the sermon would be in the mail on its way to Booker the next day. And if you wanted a streetcar conductor job in Cincinnati, the whites wanted to know, is it all right with Booker? If it wasn't all right with Booker, you didn't get the job. And yet, he delivered a lot behind this educational dictator. Yet, the real opposition to Booker T. Washington did not come from Dubois. The real opposition to Booker T. Washington came from a man in Boston that we call the Boston Brahmin. Mean high caste, high class. William Monroe Trotter. Among those Boston almost white blacks, I call the Light Brigade. Born with money by virtue of having a white father. Home, Harvard graduate. They're part of the time with Dubois, personal friend. All the necessities. Then he married into the Light Brigade. And she had money. And yet he would exhaust most of this money in the struggle for black rights. He began his fight against Booker T. Washington in his newspaper, the Boston Guardian. He gave no quarter, he asked no quarter. He fought him till the day he died. He said that we need an alternative. We need not be locked to one man and one method. He had nothing against the educational policies of Booker T. Washington that was basically good then and now. But he thought the political views were terrible, and that Booker T. Washington paid too high a price for what he got from the whites. For what he got from the whites, Booker T. Washington was silent on lynching, silent on a whole lot of things. Silent on the mistreatment of blacks, silent on the famous Brownsville raid, but we come to that later. Monroe Trotter thought that this was paying too much. When Booker T. Washington comes to Boston 1903 to lecture in a church, Trotter starts noise in the church, started a protest meeting right in the church, got thrown out and got in jail, came out and started picketing the next place Booker T. Washington spoke. Showed no mercy. Trotter was one of the most brilliant black journalists we've ever produced in this country. Along with Trotter would also merge another journalist, too often forgotten, T. Thomas Fortune. T. Thomas Fortune supported Booker T. Washington and criticized him. Near the end of his life, he was one of the editors of Garvey's Negro World. Brilliant journalist. We had journalists then, the lack of which we don't have one today. We have regressed. If we had those kind of journalists, they would be editorially on the case, especially about the housing condition, the boarded up houses, and the whole planned shrinkage when they literally planned to run poor people out of New York City anyway, black and white. But they would be on these cases. But we don't have them. We don't have them anymore. All right, 1903. W.E.B. Du Bois would write a small masterpiece, be a collection of his essays, Souls of Black Folks. Still worth reading. You can get a cheap edition because it's being sold everywhere. And not to have read Souls of Black Folks is a disservice to you as a person who was a member of the African race. He followed with Gifts of Black Folks. This man was a monumental giant, the finest intellect we have produced in the whole of the Western world. All right, now W.E.B. Du Bois would start his teaching career. He did not dislike Booker T. Washington. Booker T. Washington had sent him a letter asking him to come to teach at Tuskegee. He wrote 2 books with Booker T. Washington. They're still in existence. But the people at Wilberforce had sent him a letter earlier, and the people at Wilberforce was offering him, please listen, for a year's work, $950, and Tuskegee was offering him $900. So he went to Wilberforce, where he got into a little trouble. W.E.B. Du Bois always, he was a religious man, but he questioned the overuse of it all and the misuse by people lacking sincerity. So he came into a meeting at Wilberforce, a student meeting, being the senior professor there, and one of the few adults there. One of the students announced that Professor Du Bois would lead us in prayer. He said, no, I won't. My kind of praying will get the school closed down. That was a Presbyterian school. It was a church school. He almost lost his job. He didn't last for 2 years there anyway. And he writes about the professors were so smug, they would come to the table and speak to you in Greek or Latin. And if you didn't speak good Greek and Latin, you didn't rate there. I mean, can you imagine some black professors coming at a breakfast table conversing in Greek and Latin? Not Swahili or Wolof or some African language. Greek and Latin. And if you can't do it right, you're probably not qualified to be a professor, and your contract will probably not be renewed.
The relationship between W.E.B. Du Bois and Booker T. Washington is often misunderstood. While both men were committed to the advancement of African Americans, their approaches and philosophies diverged significantly. Washington, who founded the Tuskegee Institute, advocated for vocational education and economic self-sufficiency, believing that African Americans should focus on building practical skills and proving their worth through hard work and economic success. In contrast, Du Bois championed higher education and political activism, arguing that a talented tenth of educated African Americans should lead the fight for civil rights and social equality. The ideological rift led to tensions between the two leaders, with Du Bois criticizing Washington's approach as to accommodating to the status quo of racial segregation and disenfranchisement. However, their differing strategies both played crucial roles in the broader struggle for African American empowerment and laid the groundwork for future civil rights movements. In this last video examining Dr. Clarke's breakdown of Booker T. Washington, W.E.B. Du Bois, their impacts and contributions on Black America, we're going to look at Pan-Africanism and how Pan-Africanism played a role in helping African Americans work to realize self-actualization and work to realize their place here in the world. So let's cover a couple things that Dr. Clarke mentioned that stood out to me, that Dr. Clarke mentioned in this last part of the lecture, but also taking a look at the people who contributed to Pan-Africanism, W.E.B. Du Bois, Booker T. Washington, their relationship, and even other people who played a part in their relationship, either being fractured or their relationship coming together, but just all of the elements that we've discussed in these past 3 videos: the speech, the movement of Black people to the North after Booker T. Washington's speech, the rise of Jim Crow, and now how Pan-African plays a part in Black people working towards self-actualization. One of the first things that stood out to me that Dr. Clarke was pointing out was the rise of radicals in Jamaica, the rise of radical thought, the rise of radical actions against the system of white supremacy, against colonization. And he talked about specifically Albert Thorne, Robert Love, and Marcus Garvey as being some of the key or some of the significant radicals in Jamaica, revolting or creating ideals, or people who came from Jamaica who became radicals against the ideals of white supremacy. I have to learn more about Robert Love and Albert Thorne, but I'm familiar with Marcus Garvey. Dr. Clarke also pointed out that pointed out how Pan-Africanism began and how Pan-Africanism spread throughout the West and Africa. And he talked about a Caribbean man, a Trinidadian man specifically, named Henry Sylvester Williams, or H. Sylvester Williams. He was a part of the creation of the Pan-African League, a part of the creation of the first Pan-African Conference, and collaborating with W.E.B. Du Bois was able to have a succession of Pan-African conferences. So Henry Sylvester Williams, along with 2 other key Pan-Africanists that came from Trinidad that Dr. Clarke pointed out. Once again, Henry Sylvester Williams, George Padmore, and C.L.R. James. And I talk about these 3 men in my 4th book, On the Shoulders of Giants, Volume 4, The Caribbean. You should check it out. But they pushed Pan-Africanism. Well, Dr. Clarke pointed out that these men were successful at pushing the ideas of Pan-Africanism and spreading the ideas of Pan-Africanism throughout the diaspora. But like a lot of Black people who can spread ideas abroad, they struggled being able to unite their homeland. So they could not unite Trinidad and bring those ideas and help uplift and empower the Trinidadians. So he also talked about, in addition to these men not being able to unite Trinidad with the Pan-African ideas and with the Pan-African activities, but how many Pan-Africanists, like many people, they needed to leave their homes to flourish. So they may or may not have become the great people that they were if they would have stayed in their homelands. Their ideas may not have been accepted or championed or even supported if they would have stayed in their homeland. So like a lot of people, you have to go abroad and leave your home to become somebody, to grow up and to develop ideologies and to have your ideologies nurtured by the people around you. So he also talked about the Europeans using intelligent strategies to create a dependent class. So creating an atmosphere where the Africans that they were colonizing were totally dependent upon them for their survival like we are today. And Africans in the UK and Africans in the USA were both under these similar but different colonial rules. Of course, it's all for slave labor, it's all for dominance, but different types of colonial rule, but similar but different colonial rule. But the overall outcome was to make these groups of people dependent upon the dominant class. And here we are today, still dependent upon the dominant class. Hey, look at these political climate times. Look at how you have groups of black people clamoring to take the crumbs off the table of the white man. And he also pointed out how, because of this white control, because of the mindset that was instilled into the Africans even go as far as to argue over who had the better oppressor or whose oppressor was worst. Like, well, your oppression was worse than mine because my master did this, and our oppressors did this, and your oppressors did that. Our oppressors were more sophisticated instead of concentrating on the fact that you both are still oppressed. Your oppression affect you vertically. Your oppression affected you horizontally, but you both are still oppressed. Think about it. He also talked about how Booker T. Washington, through his influence and his activities and this relationship and proximity to white America, pretty much became the kingpin of black America. So a lot of the funding, a lot of the ideas, a lot of the things that would flow through white America that could go to help or hurt black America had to flow through Booker T. Washington. So Booker T. Washington had a lot of power and influence, probably one of the most powerful people in black America at the time, if not the most powerful people in black America, the way Dr. Clarke is describing it, because philanthropy, people wanted to donate money, people wanted to give back to blacks, people wanted to empower, uplift blacks, things, according to Dr. Clarke, it all had to be funneled through Booker T. Washington because that's the power and the influence that he had. Also around the time of Booker T. Washington having this great influence, W.E.B. Du Bois, after his rise, he's attending the first Pan-African conference. So he's now lending his intellect and his capabilities to Henry Sylvester Williams, George Padmore, C.L.R. James, and other people who were participating in the Pan-African conference or congresses at the time. Remember, the first Pan-African Congress was in 1900. Booker T. Washington's ideas of self-reliance may not have been championed by a majority of people here in America, according to Dr. Clarke, but Dr. Clarke is saying in this that Booker T. Washington's ideas of self-reliance spread to Africa, and when they spread to Africa, they were not only accepted, but they were celebrated and utilized. They were beneficial to African people. So the ideas, Booker T. Washington's ideas didn't completely fall on deaf ears, even though we know he had supporters, but even outside of black America, people saw Booker T. Washington's ideas as useful and utilized them. Even I think both Booker T. Washington, once again, both Booker T. Washington and W.E.B. Du Bois' ideas were both useful. We could use both. So Dr. Clarke also Dr. Clarke points out that Booker T. Washington's ideas of politics were misunderstood. According to Dr. Clarke, Booker T. Washington was trying to explain to people that once you have the group economics, once you're able to build for yourself, once you're able to produce for yourself, you're able to grab more political power. Economic power can help us establish ourselves and gain political power. The idea of gaining political power before economic power didn't make sense to him. So build up first. Make sure we have something. Make sure we can support ourselves. Make sure we can feed ourselves. Make sure we can clothe ourselves and shield ourselves and make a profit for ourselves before we try to have a foothold in its political world. Because we might not, well, it's not might not, we won't get the respect we need. We don't have leverage. We don't have anything that we can use to help ourselves get political power, especially if we don't have economic power. Booker T. Washington believed Du Bois's ideas were backwards. So Du Bois wanted to build political power before economic power. But once again, that was the opposite. And Washington felt like economics is the way to go. We have to have an economic base. If we don't have an economic base, we just howling at the moon right now. So Dr. Clarke also started to point out about the need for us to be able to build, create, and produce for ourselves. Not just nation building, but nation management. He specifically used the words nation management. Because once you build it, you have to manage it. But you have to have people who are capable of managing it before you build it. So pointing our minds on building, creating, producing, and being able to manage what we build and create and produce, and not just manage it, but protect it. Because if you build it, you must protect it. So Dr. Clarke also points out that, in his opinion, W.E.B. Du Bois wasn't Booker T. Washington's biggest opposition. His biggest opposition was William Monroe Trotter. And he was a fair-skinned, rich black man who believed black people needed an alternative to Booker T. Washington politically. And he also pointed out how much of a brilliant black journalist that William Monroe Trotter was, and William Monroe Trotter made significant contributions to journalism in Black America, and he was one of the journalists who had integrity at the time, even though he was a big critic of Booker T. Washington. And he would point out, Trotter would point out a lot that Booker T. Washington was silent on the mistreatment of blacks at the time, probably because of the position that he held within Black America and within white America. And then one of the last things that Dr. Clarke pointed out was the year 1903, when W.E.B. Du Bois published his book, The Soul of Black Folks. He emphasized that we read that book. He stated that Du Bois was one of the finest, or the finest intellect that we produced, and Du Bois and Booker T. Washington's relationship wasn't as bad as you thought it was, because they wrote 2 books together. So we should further examine the relationship between Booker T. Washington and W.E.B. Du Bois, and not just get distracted by the rifts or the disagreements that they had. We should study more about William Monroe Trotter. We should learn more about the rise of Pan-Africanism. Also, who was the other gentleman that I was? Albert Thorne and Robert Love. We need to research and learn more about Albert Thorne, Robert Love, and William Monroe Trotter. So this is the last video of this particular audio clip that I have of Dr. Clarke breaking down Booker T. Washington's speech, his Atlanta Compromise speech. So I hope you all enjoyed these videos. Hope you learned something, because the key is to, yes, consume the information, listen to the lectures, love the lectures, but we need to think critically about the information that we're consuming and come up with intelligent ways of us using this information to improve our present so we have a brighter future. Stay black, stay beautiful, stay powerful. I love you all. Make sure you catch the next video coming up.